All right. Good morning, everyone. While we wait for everyone to arrive, I'll go over some introductions and basic information for our webinar this morning. So this is the Best Practices for REACH Compliance webinar, and thank you all very much for joining us. Your computer audio is set to mute for all of you, so we won't be able to hear you if you speak. If you have any questions or you need us to repeat anything, you can type your questions or comments into the Q&A or chat boxes in your Zoom control panel, and we'll see them there. My name is Amy Groughton, and I'm the Marketing Manager at GreenSoft. And I'll be your host for this webinar, and our presenter today is Randy Flinders. He's GreenSoft's Senior Manager of Product Support. Randy has been with GreenSoft for 3 years, and he's been working in product certification and compliance for over 20 years. So thank you for presenting this webinar for us today, Randy. I am here in Los Angeles, California. Randy is live in Las Vegas, Nevada. And most of you are joining us from the US today, but we actually have some international attendees as well. We have people here from India, India, Israel, Canada, Taiwan, Denmark, Belgium, Finland, and Germany. Just looking over the attendee list, those are the ones that jump out at me, but it looks like we even have Sweden and Australia. So we have a big group here today and a diverse group. Thank you again all very much for joining us. Just a couple more things before I hand it over to Randy. If you have any questions during the webinar, again, you can go ahead and type them into your Q&A box. Randy will answer all the questions at the end of the webinar. And a document with all the questions and Randy's answers to them will be sent to each of you in a few days after the webinar. And also this webinar is being recorded, so a link to the recording will be sent to each of you in a few days as well, and you can review that. So with that, let's turn it over to Randy and we'll get started.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I appreciate the introduction. And again, I just want to welcome everybody and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I know we all have busy schedules, so I'm going to try and make this worth your time. Okay, we do have a lot of information to cover here, so I'm just going to get right into it and get going here. I know that it's only 8:32, so we might have some people that are still joining, but the initial part of it actually is kind of just basic information, so maybe we can get started on that. Okay, so let me just get going here. Okay. So my name is Randy Flinders. As Amy said, I am the Senior Manager of Product Support. I'm also one of the technical leads here at GreenSoft. After this presentation, if you have any more information that you need or anything, feel free to contact me. My contact information will be provided at the end through email. Okay. So what we're going to cover here today is I'm going to go over who we are, GreenSoft, what we do. Then I'm going to get right into the areas of concern for article producers. So if you produce products, electronic products or otherwise, what areas should you be most concerned about? And we're going to talk about that a little bit. Then we're going to go into the specific issues, basically the SVHC candidate list, the REACH Annex 14 list, the REACH Annex 17 list, and what all those things mean, what our requirements are, and what we need to do. We're also going to go into the changes to the definition of an article. This has been reinterpreted by the European Court of Justice, and as such, it really completely changes how we do our REACH calculations when we're evaluating our products for SVHCs. And we're going to talk about that in detail and look at some examples of that. And then finally, we'll go into the advantage of working with GreenSoft on REACH compliance. And then after that, we're going to have some time for questions and answers. So as Amy said, please, if you have any questions, go ahead. There should be a button on your control panel for Q&A. Just go ahead and hit that button, type your question in there, and at the end, we'll address the questions. If in the end we have too many questions and we don't address them all, they'll be addressed in the email that we send out afterwards. Okay, so GreenSoft. Who are we? What do we do? We've been around for about 15 years. And we're basically two companies in one. We're a data management company and we're a software company. So what we do is we collect data from the supply chain, we validate that data, we work with the suppliers to ensure that the data is correct and accurate. We convert it to any format that it's needed in and deliver it to our customers. That's the data side. On the software side, we have software tools that are basically a whole suite of tools available for any size company or organization based on their needs, anywhere from cloud-based to land-based to complete enterprise-based global solutions. So whether you need a complete in-house software solution and data, whether you just have one product you need to validate for reach, GreenSoft has it covered. We do a customized approach. So that's kind of what we do, okay? We have lots of experience in doing this, as I said, 15 years. And so whether you have one product or an entire system you need to put together, we've got your back, okay? GreenSoft is headquartered in Pasadena, California, but we have offices all over the world, okay? So no matter where your factories, your regions, wherever you're sourcing your parts from, we have offices everywhere, okay? Our main office where we do most of the data collection and validation is in China, about 180 miles south of Beijing. And our data collection and validation processes are all incorporated in our quality system, and our systems are ISO 9000 certified. Okay, so just to give you an idea of some of the experience that we have and some of the customers that we work with, you can see that we work with companies through all kinds of different industries, from communications to semiconductors, medical, and everything in between. We work with small and medium-sized companies, even work with startups. We also work with huge global conglomerates like 3M and GE. So we have a deep experience, and so don't feel like, that we don't have experience in dealing with your situation, because more than likely we do. And another thing that's interesting is that we actually have a lot of customers in Asia because of our unique situation of our team situated in China and having such a great relationship with your Asian suppliers, okay? And I know that this presentation right now that we're talking about is best practices for REACH. So we're going to focus on REACH. But I do want to make the point here that REACH is just one regulation in a sea of regulations, and we can help you with all of them. Okay? What you see here is just a small snapshot of kind of the regulations that you're going to see. Okay, so now that you know a little bit about GreenSoft, what we do, where we're coming from when we talk about REACH, let's go into the meat of the presentation. Okay, so what should we be concerned about as article producers? We make products. We have to comply with REACH. What are the kind of things that we need to be concerned about? Well, first of all, we have to understand what REACH is. REACH is a legislation in Europe that requires authorization, notification, and communication if certain substances are present in mixtures or substances manufactured or imported into the EU, and also provides some restrictions on the use of those substances and mixtures. Our problem is that the regulation includes substances and mixtures that are present in products. In other words, if you use those substances to make your product, you're still in scope for this regulation. That's where our issue comes in. And we also have to be aware that if we have an article that expels a mixture or substance, for an example, an ink cartridge or a toner cartridge, we have to treat it as both. We're importing the cartridge as an article and the substance we're expelling as a mixture, and so we're going to have to do a double evaluation on that particular item. So that's just something that we need to keep in mind, okay? So what do we need to be concerned with? What do we need to be thinking about? Okay, some questions we need to ask ourselves. First of all, as we said, does the article expel any mixtures or substances? Because that's a game changer from an evaluation perspective. We need to know that for sure. Is the article manufactured inside the EU, or is it imported into the EU? That distinction actually matters, and we're going to find out why later. Okay? The other thing that we really need here is a clear understanding of what the definition of an article really is. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the industry about this. There's, the European Chemicals Agency is constantly issuing new drafts of guidance documents trying to help us all understand what an article really is, because ever since the European Court of Justice reinterpreted that, it's been kind of up in the air. So we're going to talk about what that really means and give you some examples about that later. But we need to really understand that's something we need to focus on our understanding of, okay? The next thing we need to be aware of is whether there are any Annex 17 restriction entries that apply to our type of product. The applicability of scope is so varied for that annex that we really need to understand those entries and understand what applies to our product before we can move forward with validating compliance. And then the one thing we need to always remember is that the SVHC list, the annexes, they always get updated all the time, and SVHC gets updated every 6 months. So we can't just do this once and then claim compliance. This is an ongoing process. As soon as we've validated our REACH compliance, we move on to validating it again. And one other point you need to remember here, and this is very important, is regardless what the regulations say, it's your customers that define what you need to produce for them. So if your customers' requirements or their environmental specifications require additional information besides the minimum required by the regulation, then you're going to have to collect that additional information from your supply chain in order to provide it. For that reason, you need to consider your customer requirements even above the regulatory requirements. Okay, so now that we're all scared about all these things we need to do, we have concerns that we need to address, let's look at these requirements and how we can address them. Let's talk about the SVHC list. Okay, so what is the SVHC list? It's the substances of very high concern list. It's a candidate list of substances that may in the future be added to the Annex 14 or Annex 17 lists, basically. But in the meantime, before, if they ever get added or not is not a concern, we still have responsibilities now that they've been identified as substances of very high concern. We need to review our products and see if those substances are present in our product or any subarticles within our product in amounts greater than 1,000 parts per million. Okay? If we find that's the case, we have one of those substances present, it is present in one of the articles in our product over 1,000 parts per million, then that triggers some requirements for us. We must communicate that information up our supply chain, or I should say down our supply chain, to professional users, not end users. You don't have to put this in the user manual. You don't have to put it on your website. You don't have to tell the end customer that's using the product that the substance is there. Who do you have to tell? You need to tell any OEM you're providing the product with that's incorporating your product into theirs. You have to tell any reseller. You have to tell any distributor, okay? So anybody that's handling your product after you that's not the end user needs this information, okay? Luckily, all you really need to provide is the name of the SVHC present, okay? However, many of your OEMs or customers are going to actually require more than just the name. They're going to want to know how much is there and where it is in your product, so be prepared for that, right? Okay, so now we say, okay, we have this substance present. We've communicated that to the professional users, okay? So what other obligations do we have? Well, if, as a result of containing that SVHC in your product, you are importing or producing that product in the EU in a way that produces on the market more than 1 ton per year of that substance, now you have to notify the European Chemicals Agency. Now, there are some things that maybe you don't have to notify them, so I put you maybe triggered notification. But regardless, you do need to track the volume of the SVHC that's being imported as a result of it being present in your product over 1,000 parts per million, so you know whether you may have notification responsibilities or not, okay? There's currently 173 substances on the list. We expect probably around next month for more substances to be added. They're added twice per year. So whatever data you're collecting, if it's not 100% full material data, it's got a very short lifespan when it comes to REACH validation. You're going to have to continuously update that data to incorporate the new substances that are being added. Okay. So we're going to get more into an article definition later, so I don't want to do this too much here, but I did want to mention this because this is something that is really on everybody's mind when they're dealing with SVHC validation, okay? First of all, an article definition. How do we calculate concentrations of an article if we don't know what the article is? We have to do that. So what is an article? Well, an article is an object which during production is given a special shape, surface, or design which determines its function to a greater degree than does its chemical composition. All right, that's a lot of words. What does it mean? It basically means, is the product what it is because of what it's built as, or is it because of what it's made of? So let's take an example. I have a heat sink that I'm attaching to an IC. I use thermal paste between the heat sink and the IC. That heat sink is an article. It's a heat sink because of how it's shaped. how it's formed. It doesn't matter where I use iron or steel or aluminum. It's still a heat sink. It's an article. The thermal paste, the surface design, the shape is irrelevant. It's the chemical composition of the thermal paste that makes it thermal paste. That is not an article, okay? That's important for us to understand that initially. So the problem is that manufacturers originally decided that they would interpret the definition of an article as the device they were selling. So as an example, if I'm selling a 20-inch CRT display or a flat panel display, okay, I would say, okay, well, I have an SVHC in my flat panel display, but my flat panel display is an article, so I'm going to calculate the concentration of that SVHC based on the mass of my flat panel display. Well, some of the member states had a problem with that methodology and went to court. The European Court of Justice decided, no, anything that was an article before it went into your flat panel display is still an article, and you need to calculate the concentration based on the mass of the article that that SVHC was present in. So now we're calculating our SVHCs completely differently than we have in the past, okay? This means any past validations you did need to be redone in a different way, and you need to understand that that may impact the compliance status of existing products, and it may cause you to review your process to ensure that you're updating your process to do these calculations differently. And we're going to get into some really detailed examples of that later. Okay, so best practices here. How are we going to do SVHC compliance validation? First of all, we need to collect full material declaration data. What that means is that when you send me your data, every single microgram of that part is accounted for. I know if the part weighs 1 gram, I have 1 grams of substances listed in this full material declaration. But you have to pay attention to proprietary substances, because a lot of time, especially when you're dealing with PCB manufacturers, when you're dealing with ASIC or IC manufacturers, you have a proprietary substance in there, an epoxy that they'll say proprietary brominated epoxy or some kind of thing like that. In that case, they are disclosing full material declaration. They are telling us what's in there, but they're not going down to the substance level and telling us, hey, this epoxy contains these substances. So when we get a new SVHC list published, we don't know if that epoxy contains the new SVHCs or not. So we're going to have to go back and collect the REACH COC in addition to the FMD because of proprietary substances. So it's very important to, number one, try and get full material declaration for every single part and material you're using, but evaluate that FMD data you are receiving to make sure it's truly FMD and does not contain any withheld information regarding trade secret or proprietary substances. Okay, and keep in mind that this interaction with your supplier, you're going to need to be persistent and patient. This is not usually something where they go, oh, I know exactly what you need, here you go, and this is what you need. It's going to take a couple times of going back and forth for them to understand what you're asking them for and get it to you. So you need to have a process-oriented collection system in place where you're actually tracking your contacts with your suppliers and escalating as things go on down the road, so that you don't have requests sitting out there forever and that your suppliers get accustomed to dealing with you. So be prepared for the amount of resources it takes. On average, we see that it takes 4 different specific communications with the supplier to get viable, validated, accurate data out of them on average. So if you say you have, say, 1,000 parts, 10,000 parts that you're using in your database, and you need to validate these every 6 months, then you're looking at 10,000 communications or so a month. Maybe not. Maybe a lot of those parts came from the same supplier. Let's say you have 200 suppliers. So you're doing 200 times 4 is 800 communications every 6 months. That's a lot of resources. That's what we offload to you from you if you work with us. But if you're not working with us and you plan on doing this yourself, you need to plan on the resources needed on the collection side, okay? Once you receive that data too, you need to have a good process for validating that data for accuracy, completeness, and correctness. So they're sending you data. They say, we're claiming these RoHS exemptions or whatever, and then you see that there's no lead in that material declaration. They send you, there's a conflict. Someone needs to be checking for those kinds of things. Someone needs to be making sure that the data they're sending makes sense, that the numbers they're sending add up, and that something here is matching something else that you've received from them. So there has to be some validation, some error checking there. I call this garbage in, garbage out. And this is the problem I see with solutions out there that use portals. You simply upload your part list to a portal, and the portal sends out about a million automated emails and says, hey, supplier, upload this data to me. The supplier uploads whatever data they have, and then the portal goes, thanks, done. So they're uploading a PDF that they have printed out of an old material declaration from 2 years ago that has expired exemption information in it. Yeah, well, an automated portal can't check that PDF. Someone's going to have to look at that PDF, and if your partner's not doing it, then you better staff up to do that, okay? Another issue you need to really, really be careful with is built-to-spec items. So, for example, if you build a chassis for something and you make up a drawing, you send that to some kind of fabricator, they fabricate it based on your drawing, and they deliver 1,200 chassis to you. Now it's time to go collect a full material declaration from that supplier, and they come to you and say, hey, we're just a fab house. We don't track the material content data of the steel we buy. We built this to your spec, and that's all we did. And we never guaranteed you we were going to give you data. And so now you're in a pickle because you can't show any kind of due diligence of what's in this chassis. So you can work with your fabricators to make sure they can provide that. But what you need is a process in place for these types of items that have been fabricated that you can't get data from the suppliers. We have an entire team dedicated to doing just that. We have an entire process built around resolving fabricated parts where the supply chain can't provide data. You need to have the same kind of thing in place. You need to have some way to deal with those parts, or else you're going to get stuck in the mud. Right on. Okay. So when you look at this graphic here on this slide, you can see that typically we can resolve about 80 to 85% of the parts that companies use based on collecting from suppliers. There'll be about another 10% that are based on fabricated parts, and we're going to have to actually resolve those using other methods besides collecting the data from the supply chain. Whether it's drawing validations, it's scrubbing, raw material specifications, whatever it is we need to do to help you, we can do that. Or you can help yourself do that, but plan on that. Plan on 10% or so being parts you need to resolve yourself. And then there will be a remaining, I don't know, maybe 5% or so that you can't resolve. The supplier doesn't have the data you need, and they're unwilling to get it for you, right? And it's not a drawing-based part we can resolve through other means. And so now you have two choices. You can either test that part and keep testing it, or you can find a replacement supplier that can produce a part that's willing to give you the data you need to support your compliance requirements. Either way, we have partnerships with test labs to help you with the testing side, and we maintain a replacement part database so that if you ever need a replacement, say capacitor, resistor, whatever, we have a list of suppliers that can give you the data you need, and so we can help you resource those parts, okay? All right. So SVHC, that was the big meaty part. Let's get into some of these other things. Annex 14, the authorization list. Let's talk about this one. Okay, what is Annex 14? A lot of companies are just starting to realize that Annex 14 and Annex 17 are there, and they need to worry about these as well as SVHC. What is Annex 14? Okay, Annex 14 provides some requirements on certain SVHCs which have been deemed as restricted in certain applications. So in other words, once SVHC is added to the Annex 14 list, it cannot be used without its use, that specific use, being authorized by the European Chemicals Agency. So what does that mean? That means that if you're going to use an Annex 14 substance at all, you're going to have to make sure it's either already been authorized for that use or submit an application to have it authorized for that use. But we're in a good position here as article providers because Annex 14 is not applicable to articles that are imported into the European Union. So if I make products in China and ship them to Europe, if I make them in Texas and ship them to Europe, Annex 14 is not applicable to me, in theory, okay? But if I build my products in the EU, then those substance restrictions may be applicable to me, okay? Because if the factory in the EU is using that substance to build my product, then I have to make sure that that substance has been authorized for that particular use, or I can't build my product in the EU. That's important. So now what's happening here? is that companies, the big top tier companies, the big computer companies, because they have fabricators in the EU, they have assemblers in the EU, they have contract manufacturers in the EU, they are starting to require that their suppliers provide them Annex 14 information. And it's not because they're concerned they're using the substances in the EU and that they may be responsible for authorization, but what they're concerned is if the substance is present in their products and they're building those products in the EU, they need to be able to show from a due diligence perspective that those substances weren't incorporated to the product in the EU, but rather were imported in a sub-article from outside the EU and therefore are exempt. So it's the traceability they're looking for. They're not necessarily concerned about non-compliance, but you're still on the hook to provide them that information. And I'm seeing this more and more and more, which is why Annex 14 is getting on everybody's radar now, okay? So one thing that I do want to make is that if you have an article that expels a substance or mixture, or you import substances or mixtures, for example, you provide a bottle of cleaning solution with some kind of device you're selling, that cleaning solution is subject to Annex 14, even if it's being imported from outside the EU. Only products and articles are exempted from Annex 14 when being imported in. Okay, so what's our best practices here? How are we going to address Annex 14? Okay, well, first of all, we're going to try and get our full material declaration, because if we have a real full material declaration, we can use that to validate whether those substances are present or not. Okay. Again, we're probably going to need a lot of certificates of compliance due to proprietary substances and also due to suppliers that cannot give us full material declaration. Some of them are out there, obviously. Okay. We need to know, too, that there's no minimum threshold for the use of these substances. So these aren't allowed if they're under 1,000 parts per million. When we're doing an SVHC validation, we say, okay, is this substance present in the article over 1,000 parts per million? For Annex 14, it's, is this substance present at all? Do we use it at all? 0 ppm is the threshold. So any COCs we collect for SVHC validation are meaningless for Annex 14. So if we want Annex 14 information from our suppliers, we're going to have to specifically tell them that, because what we're probably going to get if we just ask for a REACH validation is an SVHC COC. So be aware of that, okay? We need to define exactly what we need from them, all right? And then if we're using a software tool to do product reporting, we need to make sure that it has the ability to roll up the component level to the product level. So you can actually roll that up and detect the presence of any of these substances present, okay? All right, so that's Annex 14. That's the authorization list. Again, just mostly not applicable to article manufacturers, but it's starting to be pushed on us anyway. All right, so now let's get into Annex 17. Annex 17 is a completely different animal. Annex 17 is a list of substances that are prohibited for use or restricted for use in certain predefined applications, okay? And the problem with this thing is that the scope and applicability of these requirements are all over the place. And it's very difficult to come up with like one list of substances we can run against an electronic product because of the way the regulation is written. Keep in mind that REACH wasn't written to be directed at electronics. It was written to be directed at chemical manufacturers, and just happens to incorporate manufacturers of everything else. So it's not necessarily designed to be easy for us to comply with, all right? One of the main issues with this is that several of the entries in the Annex 17 don't actually list substances, but say, hey, you know, any substances that are this type of category of substance as referenced in the CLP directive are also restricted in these applications. So now we're in a situation where we can't just go to the European Chemical Agency site and download their substance list, because that substance list is not complete. That's not the entire Annex 17 list. So we have to use that in accordance with the CLP directive and maybe other directives as well to identify substances it calls out. Okay, so here's some examples here of the 67 entries and how they vary in scope and applicability. So example 1 restricts BPA. We know there's a lot of effort to remove BPA out of the supply stream. But if we were to just run an Annex 17 list against our products, any anything that had BPA would flag. Is, oh, hey, Annex 17 substance present. But when we go into the entry and we look at what the applicability is, we see that it's only in thermal paper made available after January 2020. So if I'm selling a monitor, I probably don't have thermal paper in it. So even though I do have BPA in that monitor, I am not violating the restriction for Annex 17. So the understanding of the entries and their applicability are very important and makes it very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all validation effort, because if you're making toys, your entries are going to be different than if you're making a monitor, and that's going to be different than if you're making textiles, and so it's all over the place, right? You know, an example too of cadmium in articles under entry 23. Oh, well, cadmium we know is a RoHS substance, so say we have cadmium in plating. Well, we may be violating the RoHS directive, but we may not be violating entry 23 of Annex 17. Because when we dig deep into that restriction of cadmium, we find that it's restricting cadmium in certain polymers and paints within articles. Are we using those polymers? Are we using those kind of paints? Further research is needed to determine if our use of cadmium is restricted under that entry or not. And then finally, if you look at example 3 here, this is what I'm talking about. It restricts substances which appear in the CLP directive, classified as germ cell mutagen category 1A or 1B, or mutagen category 1 or 2. Okay? So, technically, that entry applies to substances and mixtures, including substances and mixtures that are expelled from articles. So we need to understand what those substances are and whether or not that applies to our product. So there's a great deal of front-end work we have to do before we can even run an analysis on our product, okay? And many of these entries don't apply to articles at all. So just simply putting out a substance list and going after our products is not viable and useless, really, from a results perspective. So what can we do about this? This looks like it's almost impossible. Well, it's not, but it is difficult unless you have the right tools. So again, just like everything else, we're going to have to try and get FMD on this and get COCs if we have proprietary substances or no FMD data. That's just what we have to do, okay? And there's no way we're going to be able to do a quick assessment of our products to Annex 17 without some kind of tool. We have to have a tool, and that tool should be able to apply the restrictions based on the type of product we're running it against. Our tool has to be smart enough to know that the substances that are applicable or that are restricted on textiles are not applicable to our display monitor, are not applicable to our Ethernet card. We have to be able to run those kind of assessments, okay? If you don't pre-filter first, it's going to be impossible to do a validation. There's simply too many substances and too many varied application scopes. So what are we going to do about this? Okay, well, we do need a software tool. We know that. Our software tool has this solved already. And this is a little bit of a plug, but I want you to understand how our software tool does this when you're looking at other tools, because if they don't have the capability of doing this kind of analysis, you might want to look again. All right. So what we've done is we've scrubbed the substances, including the applicable substances in the CLP directive, and we've put those into substance groups. We've divided that up into 20 use categories, right? So that you can select the categories applicable to your product, click a button, and find out whether you contain any restricted substances. From there, you can dig into the small subset to see if the entries are violated, okay? You can also do that automatically in our software by commodity code. So if you have your parts classified, for example, resistors have metal in them, they're subject to metal plating, so we're going to put a commodity code in there. So our software knows to automatically apply those, okay? So whether or not you can automatically apply doesn't really matter. What matters is that the software allows you to pre-filter before running an analysis. And here's a screenshot from one of our software packages. This is actually from our entry-level, low-cost, single-seat package. And you can see how we've divided this up so that you can simply select the individual categories to apply to your product, run the analysis, and what you've done is eliminated hours and hours and hours of research later on, okay? All right. So we went through the annexes relatively quickly, but I'm trying to keep on track here. And I think that this section is the one that's of most interest to anybody. And that's changes to the definition of an article. And we're going to review how this impacts us as manufacturers of electrical and electronic equipment. Okay. So we discussed already a lot of the background on this. And so the original definition was viewed as final article. This was the original interpretation. When we aggregated the SVHC content in our products, we did it at the final article or final product level, right? Which a few of the member states had a problem with, because really, if we had an SVHC in our product that was reportable, technically we could add a handful more screws, and all of a sudden we're not violating that threshold anymore. That didn't seem right. So they took it to court. The European Court of Justice decision, which was in September 2015, came back and said, you know what, you guys are right. Just because something gets incorporated into another article doesn't mean it stops becoming an article. Once something's an article, it's always an article, and the SVHC present there needs to be calculated according to the mass of that specific article, even if it's incorporated into a bigger one. Okay? So that changed how we calculated our compliance status completely. And if we look at these images on this slide, what we see is in the previous interpretation, we had a product. And in that product, we have a resistor represented by the red square. That resistor contained an SVHC over 0.1%. But when we calculated the SVHC concentration as a function of the whole product, it was less than 0.1%. So we did not communicate anything into our supply chain, and we did not track volumes of the SVHC to see if we have notification requirements. However, the new ruling says we need to calculate that SVHC as a function of the mass of the resistor, or even maybe a subarticle within that resistor, depending on where that SVHC is. So let's assume it's a function of the resistor. Now we've exceeded the threshold. Now we have to notify our supply chain, and we have to track the amount of that SVHC being imported as a function of this product. And if it's over 1 ton per year, we're going to have to notify, or at least look and see if we need to notify the European Chemicals Agency. So the compliance status of this particular product has changed only based on the interpretation of an article of decision change. Okay? And this is what I said earlier. Any validations we've done that said, hey, our product doesn't contain SVHCs over 1,000 parts per million, we need to redo that now, because we did that based on incorrect calculations, according to the European Court of Justice. Now, the European Chemicals Agency is actually working on a guidance document to help us understand how to deal with this. And there's been several versions that have gone through. There's currently a version 4.0 out. It has some examples of how you calculate SVHCs. Several of those are on electronic components. And you can find that online. I will send that information on where to find that along with the Q&A we're sending out at the end so that you can look at that yourself. Some good information in there. But as you read it, you start to realize this is actually kind of a scary thing. We also have a blog on this if you want to take a look. I put that here as well. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Let's look at an IC here. So we have an IC. We need to do a SVHC validation on this, but we don't know what parts of this SVHC are actually considered articles before it was built. We buy this SVHC from On Semiconductor. So let's see if we can figure this out. We're going to use our existing flow material data we got from them. We're going to assume we have some kind of construction information, okay? In this case, this IC is made of a mold compound, a lead frame, a die attach, some plating, the die, and the wire bond. So we can see right away that mold compound was not formed before this product was made, so it's not an article, right? So let's see how we figure out article here, okay? So when we look at this, we can say, you can see the article flag column. Sorry about that. We can see the article flag column here. Is where we're actually defining what the article base is for each of these materials. In other words, if there's an SVHC in one of these materials, what base are we using to calculate the concentration? So in this case, the mold compound is a submaterial of the entire IC. It is not a compound that's used in the lead frame. It is not used in the die attach. It is a separate item, but it's not an article, so therefore we have to calculate it as a function of the whole IC. However, when we look at the lead frame, we can see that the lead frame and the plating are together as one because the lead frame is plated. So the plating was not an article before this part was made. So it is just a material of the lead frame article. So when we calculate an SVHC that's present in the plating or the lead frame or both, we have to calculate that as a function of the mass of the lead frame and plating, because that article is constituted of the lead frame and the plating. So you can see what we're doing here is going through every material in this part, determining if anything in this part was an article, and then when SVHCs are present, we have to figure out which one of those subarticles that SVHC belongs to and calculate the concentration value based on that. Okay. So when we look here at how we did that, we can see that, for example, the lead frame. Well, it's the compliance of the lead frame plus the compliance, the content of the SVHC in the lead frame added to the content of the SVHC in the plating divided by the mass of both added together. Is that over 1,000 parts per million, yes or no? That determines our concentration. It's not the amount of the SVHC present in the whole part, okay? It's just the amount of SVHC present in this article, okay? The lead frame with the plating attached, okay? So when we do the whole product, then we have to take those sub-evaluations of each sub-article along with the whole article and its compounds that are not part of sub-articles and add that together. So the compliance status of the whole part is the compliance status of the lead frame, including the plating, plus the compliance status of the die, plus the compliance status of the wire bond, okay? So what we're doing is we're checking to see if any of these articles contain an SVHC over the threshold, and if they are, we're triggered. We have to communicate that, okay? That's completely different than whole part concentration values that we were using before, right? Before we were saying, hey, is this SVH present in this part? Yes or no, okay? Now, here's an example, just the final step of how you would do the same thing for a capacitor, right? In this case, we see two different levels of plating on the inner termination. So we have a situation where the inner termination actually is an article consisting of three different materials. However, every other material here is an article upon itself, right? So all we have to do is take these three articles, with this one incorporating the plating, check their compliance status, and then that's what this compliance status is, okay? And this is a little bit complicated and hard to get your mind around at first, so I encourage you guys to review these slides a few times, and then if you still want to have a talk with me about this, feel free to contact me, all right? Because this is pretty much a new concept, okay? So, some best practices on complying with this new article definition. What we need to do to our processes to make sure we're not behind on this, okay? We need to have a process in place to ensure that our suppliers have evaluated their components to this kind of level, right? And this may require we get additional information on component construction from them. We may need to know where that plating goes in order to determine how to validate that their analysis is correct, do our due diligence. We also need to consider how we communicate to our customers, because if we need this information from our suppliers, our customers need it from us. So if we're just giving them a blanket statement that says, hey, this product complies with REACH, we may want to consider saying this compart and all of its sub-articles are free of any SVHCs according to this list or something like that. We'll need to update our communications just like we're requiring our suppliers to update theirs, okay? And evaluation of a construction of a part you don't make can be complex. For example, a wire. If you have a piece of wire that's PVC insulated, and that wire was formed by pulling copper through PVC, then that insulation was an article before you made the wire, and any SVHCs in the PVC insulation need to be calculated as a function of the mass of the insulation. If the wire was formed by dipping it, then the insulation is not an article, it's simply a subpart of the wire itself, and you calculate the SVHC in the wire as a function of the mass of the wire itself and not just the insulation. So sometimes construction methodologies need to be known, okay? That information obviously is not available to us, and so we're going to have a process for dealing with that, whether we go back and to the supplier or whether we make assumptions and document those assumptions, those engineering judgments, okay? All right, we can do this kind of validation and work with your suppliers on this for you, right? And keep in mind that your software tool is going to have the ability for you to tell it, hey, this SVHC belongs to this material and that this material is an article. Otherwise, it will not be able to successfully validate compliance, okay? It's very important that you have a substance analysis system in place that can dynamically apply article definition status to different materials, okay? And keep in mind that software cannot do construction analysis for you. A software package, it can't tell you whether this plating goes on the balls in a BGA, whether it goes on the lead frame. You're going to have to tell the software that. You need human intervention for that. All right. So since we are getting low on time, I'm going to just quickly go through the GreenSoft advantage here, why it makes sense to work with us. This is the part where I get to brag a little bit about the awesome things we do. And it's also a chance for you to see what we do that we think is important so you can incorporate what we do into what you do. Okay, so we offer a customized, complete solution for companies of all sizes, markets, and needs and budgets. Okay, data collection, as we've talked about this, we can collect, validate any data you need, anything from environmental compliance data to life cycle data to, I mean, we've even done tin whisker parameters before for certain customers. So we have a very customized approach as far as data collection goes, and our data is guaranteed to be extremely accurate. We have a process in place that's, we can show you that guarantees 99.9% accuracy, okay? Data integrity is very important in this world, okay? And then our software solution, we have a hosted solution on the cloud. You don't even have to get your IT involved. You just send us your parts list and we give you a login, and now you have a very powerful tool that can do product evaluations without any deployment. We also have on-premise solutions, anything from an inexpensive single-seat entry-level option to a land-based collaborative workgroup edition to a global enterprise edition that supports multiple business units all over the world. So no matter if you're a big guy like GE, you know, or a small startup, we've got a solution for you. Even if you don't want the software, even if you just have one product, we can actually do a turnkey on one product. So you can just send us the BOM and we can send you the due diligence documentation and the product COC, right? So from that perspective, we can just take care of 100% of it for you. And that's a great tool for our customers because when they have a supplier that cannot give them what they need, they can tell them, go talk to GreenSoft and send your parts list to them and get them to give us what we need, and we will do that for them. So that's also something that we offer as value, okay? Our database of 64 million parts is basically, you get to leverage that when you work for us. So what that mean? That means that you deliver us a list of parts you need us to collect data on. There's a good chance we're going to deliver more than half of that data to you within a few weeks because we already have it, okay? So what does that do? It improves your time to market. You're leveraging the work we've already done, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can just simply take care of that for you based on previous data we've already collected. So that's huge right there. Right out of the box, you're already more than half done, okay? We have a policy of always collecting full material data and pushing our suppliers that aren't providing it to start providing it, all right? So what that does is it helps to leverage that data moving forward. So when you get a customer that comes to you and says, hey, do you have antimony trioxide in your product? You can run an analysis and say, no, I've collected full material data and I know I don't, okay? That means you only need to collect COCs when you need to, and then when you're future doing updates, yeah, an update can be as simple as, hey, has this data changed, instead of send me new documents, right? So you're lowering your resource load by leveraging this, okay? And then, of course, the data validation system, ISO certified 99% data accuracy. If you don't have a good quality process doing this yourself, then you need to be concerned about the data integrity, okay? So another thing that we offer is for a very inexpensive, low cost. Once we've delivered data to you, we will maintain that data, keep it up to date, keep going back every 6 months, collecting new reach data on it, and we will make sure that your data is always at a 6 months freshness level. So you don't have to be concerned about what elements of your database are falling out of compliance, whether or not certain suppliers are being supportive with your needs. We're taking care of all of that and making sure that once we've given you the data, you never have to worry about that data again, okay? And then obviously the software, we've gone through this several times. One of the things that I need to mention to you though, is that our software, all versions of our software offer some level of ERP and PLM integrations, and our advanced systems offer really good ERP and PLM system integration. All right. Another thing too is software is automatically updated for regulation changes, so you'll never get caught off guard by a new substance to a regulation. If something gets added to Prop 65, we're going to update the software and send you an email letting you know the software's been updated because of this regulation change. So you'll never be behind on that if you're using our software and working with us. Okay. As far as cost goes, we did a study that estimates the average cost of a company who has 10,000 parts to collect data on will spend about $46 per part on average to collect that data. Okay, outsourcing that to us, we charge a fraction of that. So we're providing an extremely high level of data integrity. We're providing a quicker data collection service and providing it for a fraction of the cost you could do it yourself. Okay. And our software is the best value in the industry, has complete compliance, product tracking, analysis, and reporting capabilities, even when you buy the low-end, single-seat, entry-level version. Okay, so that's us. That's why you should work with us. That's my plug on us. So now I'm going to turn this back over to Amy, and we're going to start going through some of the questions that we've received.
All right. Thank you, Randy. That was excellent. We've received quite a few, so let's get through this. Can we do a risk analysis and determine articles that are high risk and then collect the REACH information from those specific article manufacturers?
Okay, so the due diligence process you're putting in place is up to you and your decision of risk versus resources. Okay, so unlike the ROSE directive, where the Europeans have actually given us EN 50581 to tell us what their expectations are on us as far as performing due diligence to this regulation, REACH has not done so. They don't give us any kind of process document or the level of due diligence they expect. They just tell us, validate your product. If it's there, you have communication, notification, authorization, etc. All right, so your question is, can you just do a risk analysis of which ones are high risk and do the collection on those? The answer is yes. You can do that. Okay. Whether that's good enough to satisfy your customers or an auditor in the future, I can't answer that question because, like I said, there is no predefined level of due diligence that's required. My recommendation is that you get some kind of validation from every supplier that you use and every part of material you use. And if you want to categorize them as low risk and say, okay, these materials, we don't believe these are, these are, for our hardware parts like screws, washers, nuts, bolts that are basically zinc plated steel, there are such low risk for SVHC that we're just going to settle for a simple website statement or whatever. Okay. You may do that, but that's up to you to put that process in place. We can't tell you what level of due diligence you want to put in place, what level of risk you're willing to take. That's up to you. Okay, next question.
Okay, the SVHC list is updated every 6 months. Are Annex 14 and 17 updated at the same time?
No, they are not. The Annex 14 and Annex 17 lists are updated as needed, basically, or as the reviews are processed. Okay, so you won't see that every 6 months they're adding something to the Annex 17 list. And usually what happens when they add something to the Annex 17 list, they are adding it as an entry. So it could be a category of substances, or it could be something that's only applicable to airplanes, or what, we don't know what's coming. But it's a completely different animal than the SVHC list. The same with the authorization list, because there's a lot, once something's on the SVHC list, they start reviewing it for the authorization list. But there's a great deal of back and forth pushing and pulling between, the GMOs and the industry as far as chemical industry and things like that. So there's a lot of that going back and forth during that process. So really that process is not something that you can anticipate updates on.
Okay. And then how long after a new SVHC release do you have to provide declarations for the new release?
That technically you're expected to make this information available on the day that the substance is added. So what they do is they actually tell us in advance what the proposed substances are, so that we can pre-evaluate our products to the proposed substances, so that if they decide to add them to the SVHC list, we already knew they were coming and we've already evaluated that. That's the expectation. The reality is that most suppliers don't start the validation process or making information available on those substances until after they've been added to the list. So the expectation and the reality are actually two different things. So the best we can do is collect the most recent data our supply chain has. That's the most that we can do, right? So we can't be mad if our supplier on the day they release a substance to the SVHC can't give us that information, because that's just not how the supply chain is working. However, we work that way. As soon as those proposed substances are added, we update our software with a proposed SVHC list so that our users and our customers can immediately start evaluating whether they're at risk for those new substances being a problem in their products. Okay.
Excellent. Okay. Does Green Data Manager Desktop Edition support article flags?
We are in the process of working on that right now. We have not implemented it yet because the final guidance from the European Chemicals Agency has not been released. So what we don't want to do is institute a change that hasn't been 100% validated yet by the authorities. So we're waiting for the final guidance, which should be coming out in a few months. But in the meantime, we are in the process of putting together our plan for software updates to incorporate this. And that update will be implemented across all software versions.
Okay, if my products are SVHC compliant, can we claim the products are Annex 14 and Annex 17 compliant automatically?
Absolutely not. Okay. First of all, the substances on the Annex 17 list are completely different than the SVHC list, so they're irrelevant. Even though the Annex 14 list is actually a subset of the SVHC list, you have to remember that the Annex 14 list is a threshold of 0 parts per million. And there's also authorizations to use those substances. So just because a substance in the Annex 14 list is present doesn't mean it's not being used per the authorized method. So it may be present and still compliant. SVHC is completely different. Not to mention the fact that an SVHC declaration says, hey, we do not have these substances over 1,000 parts per million. That's meaningless when we want to know if they're over 0 parts per million. So the quick answer is no.
Okay. My customer requires our products to be REACH compliant. If I send you the BOMs for these products, what do I get back and how much?
Okay, well, first of all, REACH compliant is kind of a benign term, all right? Do they mean they want SVHC compliance? Do they want Annex 14? Do they want Annex 17? All right, so that needs to be defined first. Once we define the actual requirements from the customer, then if you sent us your parts list, whether you're using the software or not, you would receive complete due diligence documentation from every single supplier on that parts list. So for every part you're using, we will go collect the due diligence data from them, and we will provide that to you. If you're using our software, it would simply get uploaded right into the software. If you're not using our software and you've contracted us for a turnkey solution, then we would provide you a due diligence report package that had every single document we've collected from every single supplier. In addition, we can actually provide you, if you're doing a turnkey project, a REACH COC for your product, or ROSE COC, or whatever you're having us collect. But initially, we would need to actually set the scope of what REACH compliance really means. And one more comment on a product being REACH compliant. That term is not really correct. Sorry. A product can never be non-compliant with REACH. A company can be non-compliant with REACH. Being compliant with REACH means that you've evaluated your part for the presence, and if it's present, you followed your responsibilities, okay? So it either contains the substances or not. A product that contains the substances, but the manufacturer has fulfilled their communication responsibilities is still REACH compliant technically. And I just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, next question.
Cool. Okay, this is the last question, right on time. I don't want to keep you guys late. I know you have busy schedules. So what is the 45-day notification requirement in REACH?
Okay, so 45-day notification requirement. So when you have the SVHC over 1,000 parts per million in your product, you're required to communicate that to professional users only, as we talked about. You're not required to provide end users that information. However, you are required, if an end user, if a consumer asks you for the information, you have 45 days to provide that information to that user, and that information includes the name of the substance present, and safe handling and disposal instructions for that product. The end user has the right to ask you for that information, and you have 45 days to do that. And I want to put out there that I don't know who produced it, but someone now has a phone application out there that you can submit those requests directly to manufacturers from the app. So any user, any competitor, anybody can download that app and start flooding you with those requests, and you'll be required to meet them within 45 days. Okay, so I think that we've run out of time. I want to thank everybody for coming and attending and listening to me ramble on about REACH. It's one of my favorite subjects. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all your questions, but I will send out the Q&A and cover every question we didn't get to. I'm also going to include a bunch of resources on the web that you can go to for more information. And in the meantime, you should have my contact information. If you don't, we'll send that to you. If you have any additional questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to have a discussion with you. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.